there's a city that should not exist. Around 1200 BC, almost every major power center in the Mediterranean world collapsed within the span of a few decades. Mycenae, burned. Tiryns, burned. Pylos, burned to ash so completely that its final administrative records were baked hard by the very fire that destroyed the palace that housed them. Entire civilizations that had dominated the Aegean for centuries vanished so thoroughly that the Greeks who came after them didn't even remember how to write. But one city on a limestone rock in the middle of a dusty plain didn't burn. Athens sat there, watching the world around it collapse, and somehow just kept going. No destruction layer. No abandonment. While its neighbors were reduced to memory and myth, Athens quietly continued, generation after generation, through a dark age that erased almost everyone else. And from that strange, stubborn survival, something unprecedented eventually grew. Not just a city, but an idea. The idea that ordinary people, farmers, sailors, craftsmen, could rule themselves directly, without kings, without priests, without a ruling class making decisions on their behalf. That idea would go on to burn a hole through the entire history of Western politics. It would get debated by Roman senators, studied by medieval scholars, and argued over line by the men who wrote the American Constitution 2,000 years later. So the real question isn't just what happened in Athens. It's, how does a single square kilometer of rock survive a Bronze Age apocalypse, invent democracy, get sacked by Persians, Romans, Crusaders, and Ottomans, get its most sacred temple turned into a church, then a mosque, then blown up by a Venetian mortar shell, and still end up, 34 centuries later, standing as the capital of an entire nation? That's the story we're telling today. All of it. Start to finish. The city that refused to die. Let's go back to the beginning, to a version of Athens you've probably never heard of. Around 1400 BC, Athens wasn't a democracy. It wasn't even really a city in the way we'd recognize one. It was a Mycenaean stronghold, ruled by a king called Awanax, and it sat in the shadow of much bigger, much richer palatial centers down in the Peloponnese. Places like Mycenae and Tiryns, the kind of cities that show up in Homer with golden masks and lion gates. Athens, by comparison, was second tier. A regional player, not a heavyweight. But Athens had one thing going for it that mattered more than gold: the rock itself. The Acropolis is a natural fortress, a sheer limestone crag rising straight out of the Attic plain, and around 1200 BC, Athenian builders decided to make the most of it. They constructed a massive defensive wall using a technique called Cyclopean masonry. Enormous, roughly hewn limestone blocks so large that later Greeks assumed only mythical giants, the Cyclopes, could have lifted them. The wall stretched more than 700 meters around the summit, in places standing 10 meters high and over 3 meters thick. And then they did something even more interesting. Anticipating that a siege might one day cut them off from outside water, Athenian engineers dug straight down into a natural crack in the bedrock on the northwest slope, sinking a shaft nearly 40 meters deep to reach an underground spring. They built timber staircases into the rock and ran clay pipes down to the water table, an extraordinary feat of Bronze Age engineering, built purely as insurance against a catastrophe nobody could yet see coming. That catastrophe arrived within a generation. Around 1200 BC, the entire Mycenaean world began to unravel, a wave of destruction sweeping through the Aegean whose causes historians still debate. Invasion, climate collapse, internal revolt, a chain reaction of collapsing trade networks. Mycenae fell. Tiryns fell. Pylos burned so completely archaeologists can still find the ash. Athens didn't. Here's the strange part, though. That emergency water system the Athenians had built with such foresight only worked for a few decades before it collapsed and had to be abandoned, filled in with debris right as the wider catastrophe was unfolding. So Athens' survival wasn't because some brilliant engineering trick saved the day at the last minute. It survived for reasons that are, honestly, still a little mysterious. The wall held. The site wasn't attractive enough, or defensible enough, or something enough, to suffer the same fate as its neighbors. And that single fact, survival without a fire, without an abandonment, without a break in the archaeological record, changed everything that came after. Surviving the dark for the next few centuries, most of the Aegean world went quiet. Population collapsed. Writing disappeared entirely. The Greeks would have to reinvent literacy from scratch, borrowing an alphabet from Phoenician traders centuries later. This period is often called a Dark Age, and for most of Greece, it really was dark. Scattered villages, minimal trade, a level of material culture that was, in some ways, a step backward from what came before. But dig into the ground beneath Athens, specifically in the Kerameikos cemetery in the area that would later become the classical agora, and you find something unusual, an unbroken sequence of burials. Generation after generation, without interruption, stretching from what archaeologists call the sub-Mycenaean period, through the proto-geometric, and into the geometric era. People kept living here, kept burying their dead here, kept, in some quiet, continuous way, being Athenian. And they didn't just survive, they innovated. Around 1025 BC, Athenian potters developed a new style of pottery, using tools like the fast potter's wheel and compass-guided brushes to create precise, elegant geometric patterns fired at high temperatures. It sounds like a small thing. It wasn't. This pottery was good enough, distinctive enough, that Athens became an exporter, a trendsetter whose ceramic style spread across the wider Aegean world at a time when most of Greece could barely produce anything for trade at all. Slowly, inequality crept back in. Rich burials start appearing in the archaeological record. One famous grave, belonging to a woman archaeologists nicknamed the Rich Athenian Lady, was packed with imported gold jewelry and fine ivory. Political power that may have once rested loosely with a king began consolidating in the hands of aristocratic families, the Eupatridae, literally, those of noble fathers, who monopolized the offices of government and sat on an elite council called the Areopagus. And across the surrounding countryside, scattered villages were, over the course of roughly a century and a half, gradually folding themselves into a single political community centered on Athens, a process the Greeks would later mythologize as the work of the hero Theseus, but which archaeology tells us was really just slow, unglamorous consolidation. By 800 BC, Athens controlled the largest single territory of any Greek city-state, around 2,500 square kilometers of Attica, unified under one civic identity. Athens had survived the apocalypse. Now it had to figure out how to govern itself. That process was about to get very, very messy. The century of crisis. Picture Athens in the 7th century BC. Political power belongs entirely to a small circle of aristocratic families. 9 annual officials called archons run the government, and every single one of them comes from the same narrow elite. There's no written law, which means when disputes happen, the people interpreting justice are the same aristocrats who benefit from keeping the rules vague and unwritten. This is the kind of arrangement that works fine for the people on top and terribly for everyone else. And in 632 BC, that tension erupted into outright crisis when a nobleman named Cylon, flush with prestige after winning an Olympic victory, tried to seize the Acropolis and crown himself tyrant. The coup failed. The public didn't rise up to support him. But when his supporters, cornered and desperate, took sanctuary at the altar of Athena and were killed anyway, it was considered a religious sacrilege so severe that the family responsible, the Alcmaeonids, would be periodically cursed and exiled for generations afterward. If a failed coup and a religious scandal don't sound like the ingredients for stability, you're right, they weren't. A few decades later, in 621 BC, the Athenians brought in a lawgiver named Draco to write down, for the first time, an actual legal code. His laws were notoriously brutal, so harsh that draconian is still an English word today, but they did something important. They took justice out of informal blood feuds between families and put it in the hands of the state. That still wasn't enough to stop the real crisis brewing underneath everything: debt. By 594 BC, ordinary Athenian farmers were drowning. Poor harvests and aristocratic lending had trapped huge numbers of small landholders in debt they couldn't repay, forcing them to mortgage their fields, literally marking them with stone boundary markers called horoi. And, when that wasn't enough, selling themselves or their own children into slavery just to survive. Athens was one bad season away from a full-blown civil war. So the city did something remarkable. Instead of letting the crisis run its course, they handed a man named Solon extraordinary emergency powers and told him to fix it. and Solon did something almost nobody in his position was expected to do. He refused to simply hand total victory to either side. He canceled the crushing debts. He outlawed debt slavery outright and bought back Athenians who'd already been sold abroad. And then he restructured the entire basis of political power, not around bloodline anymore, but around wealth, sorting citizens into 4 economic classes that determined which offices they could hold and which military role they'd serve. It wasn't democracy yet. The wealthiest still held the highest offices. But it was the first time in Athenian history that political power was, at least in principle, something you could earn rather than something you were simply born into. Naturally, it satisfied almost nobody. The aristocrats resented losing their dead income. The poor were furious they hadn't gotten the land redistribution many had hoped for. Into that unresolved tension stepped a man named Pisistratus, who in 561 BC seized power as a tyrant. Not tyrant in our modern sense of a cruel dictator, necessarily, but in the ancient Greek sense, someone who took control outside the normal constitutional process. And here's the twist. Pisistratus was, by most accounts, good at the job. He left Solon's institutions technically intact, while quietly making sure his own allies held the key offices. He minted Athens' first standardized coinage, the famous owls, that would later become the dominant currency of the entire Aegean. He gave loans to struggling farmers. He expanded the city's major festivals, the Panathenea and the city Dionysia, into major public spectacles. He even began construction on the massive temple of Olympian Zeus, a project so ambitious it wouldn't actually be finished for another 600 years. But tyranny, even relatively benevolent tyranny, rarely survives the transition to the next generation. Pisistratus's sons inherited his power, and when one of them, Hipparchus, was assassinated in 514 BC, the surviving brother Hippias grew paranoid and repressive. Within a few years, an aristocratic family, the same Alcmaeonids who'd carried that ancient religious curse, convinced Sparta to intervene militarily and expel him. What followed was a political struggle between 2 rival aristocrats, and the man who won it, Cleisthenes, didn't just want power for himself. In 508 and 507 BC, he tore up the existing political map of Attica and rebuilt it from scratch. He abolished the old aristocratic tribal system entirely and replaced it with 10 new, deliberately artificial tribes, each one stitched together from disconnected regions across the city, the coast, and the inland countryside, specifically designed to break the local power bases that aristocratic families had relied on for generations. He formalized local villages into political units called demes. He created a new council of 500, chosen by lot rather than birth. And he introduced a strange new safety valve called ostracism. Once a year, the assembly could vote to exile any single citizen for 10 years, no trial, no crime required, simply to prevent any one person from becoming powerful enough to seize control the way Pisistratus once had. This was it. This was the moment. Athens had just built, almost by accident, the basic architecture of the world's first direct democracy. But an idea is only as strong as the city defending it. And Athens was about to be tested by the largest empire on earth. Gold, silver, and an empire of the SEA in 490 BC, the Persian Empire, the largest, richest, most powerful state the world had yet seen, landed an army on the plain of Marathon, roughly 40 kilometers from Athens. And an Athenian force of citizen soldiers, heavily outnumbered, did something nobody expected. They won. It should have ended there. It didn't. A decade later, the Persians came back, this time under Xerxes himself, with a force so large ancient writers describe it in numbers that still make historians wince. Athens made a decision that would define the next century of its history. Rather than defend the city directly, they evacuated the population and put everything on the navy. Xerxes marched in and burned what was left of the Acropolis to the ground. But out at sea, in the narrow straits of Salamis, the Athenian-led Greek fleet destroyed the Persian navy in one of the most decisive naval battles in ancient history. Athens had just survived the closest thing the ancient world had to an existential threat. And it emerged from that survival with something new, a navy, a reputation, and, thanks to a lucky discovery of silver at the mines of Laurion just a few years earlier, the financial means to keep that navy running indefinitely. So in 478 BC, Athens organized the surviving Greek city-states into a new alliance, the Delian League, officially formed to continue the fight against Persia. But here's where the story gets more complicated and more familiar than you might expect. Over the following decades, that defensive alliance slowly transformed into something else entirely, an empire. Member states paid tribute, officially to fund the shared war effort. When some tried to leave, Naxos, Thasos, Athens crushed them militarily, tore down their walls, and confiscated their land. In 454 BC, the League's treasury was physically relocated from the island of Delos to the Athenian Acropolis itself. The symbolism wasn't subtle. That imperial money didn't just sit in a vault, though. It built something extraordinary. Under the leadership of Pericles, Athens poured its tribute income into the most ambitious building program the Greek world had ever seen. And the centerpiece was the Parthenon, a temple to Athena so architecturally refined that its columns actually curve almost imperceptibly to correct for optical illusions, so that from a distance they appear perfectly straight. At the exact same time this imperial wealth was flowing in, Athenian democracy was pushing further than it ever had. Two reformers, Ephialtes and Pericles, stripped the old aristocratic council of the Areopagus of its remaining political power, and Pericles introduced something genuinely radical: paid public service. Jurors, counselors, magistrates, all now received a wage for their civic duty, which meant that for the first time, a poor citizen didn't have to choose between feeding his family and participating in government. Democracy stopped being something only the wealthy had the free time to practice. But empire and radical democracy both cost something. And the bill was about to come due. War, plague, and the unraveling Athens' rise had made Sparta and its allies nervous. Nervous enough that in 431 BC, tensions exploded into the Peloponnesian War, a conflict that would drag on, brutally, for 27 years. Pericles' strategy was simple on paper. Retreat the entire rural population of Attica behind Athens' long walls, the fortified corridor connecting the city to its port at Piraeus, and let naval supremacy keep everyone fed while Spartan land forces raged uselessly outside the walls. It might have worked, but cramming the entire population of Attica into an overcrowded city created the perfect conditions for catastrophe. Between 430 and 426 BC, an epidemic tore through the packed streets, killing roughly a third of the population, including Pericles himself. Athens had just lost the man who'd guided it through its greatest era, in the middle of the war that would decide its future. What came next was a slow unraveling. In 415 BC, Athens launched an ambitious, arguably reckless invasion of Sicily, a campaign that ended in 413 BC in near-total catastrophe, wiping out tens of thousands of soldiers and hundreds of ships in a single stroke. Sparta, sensing weakness, established a permanent fortified base inside Attica itself, at Decelia, which cut Athens off from its own silver mines and encouraged 20,000 enslaved laborers to escape. By 404 BC, it was over. Athens surrendered. Its empire was gone. Its walls were torn down. And for a brief, brutal period, Sparta installed a puppet government known to history as the 30 Tyrants, who executed over 1,500 pro-democracy citizens and confiscated their property before being overthrown themselves, less than a year later, by democratic exiles who marched back into the city and restored the constitution, along with, remarkably, a general amnesty for the very people who'd terrorized them. Athens rebuilt. It even formed a new, more modest league in 378 BC, explicitly promising not to repeat the imperial overreach of the last one. But a new threat was rising in the north, the kingdom of Macedon, under a king named Philip II who was steadily absorbing the fractured Greek city-states one by one. The great orator Demosthenes delivered speech after speech warning Athens of the danger. His Philippics remained some of the most famous political oratory in history. But in 338 BC, at the Battle of Corinea, the combined forces of Athens and Thebes were decisively defeated. Athens kept its internal self-government. It lost, for good, its ability to set its own foreign policy. Democracy, the Athenian invention that had once felt untouchable, had just quietly become a local arrangement inside someone else's empire. The city that taught the world to think. Here's the thing about Athens, though. Even as its political power was crumbling, something else was happening at exactly the same time, something that would outlast every empire that ever conquered the city. During that 5th century golden age, freedom of speech, competitive civic pride, and an open marketplace of ideas turned Athens into an intellectual magnet. Socrates spent his life in the streets and marketplaces of Athens, pioneering a method of relentless questioning that would come to define Western philosophy itself. And in 399 BC, in one of history's most uncomfortable ironies, that same democracy put him on trial and executed him for corrupting the city's youth. His student Plato, apparently unable to trust democracy again, founded a school called the Academy around 387 BC in an olive grove outside the city walls, a place dedicated to rigorous philosophical and mathematical inquiry. Plato's own student, Aristotle, would go on to found a rival school, the Lyceum, in 335 BC, essentially inventing systematic empirical research as we understand it, biology, logic, political science, all approached with the same careful, evidence-based method. At the Theater of Dionysus, on the southern slope of the Acropolis, wealthy citizens competed to sponsor dramatic productions during the city Dionysia festival, and playwrights like Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides used those stages to explore hubris, fate, and moral catastrophe in ways still performed today. Aristophanes turned the same stage into biting political satire, mocking generals and philosophers alike without much fear of consequence. Meanwhile, Thucydides, an Athenian general exiled after a military failure, turned his forced retirement into one of the first works of analytical, evidence-based history, chronicling the very war that had ended his career. None of this was an accident. It was the direct product of imperial wealth, competitive civic pride, and a culture that, for all its brutal flaws, genuinely valued argument and public speech. And it meant that even as Athens' political power faded, its cultural authority was only just beginning. A city without an empire after Alexander the Great died in 323 BC, Athens tried one last time to break free of Macedonian control, leading a rebellion known as the Persian War. It failed. A garrison was installed at Piraeus, and radical democracy was formally dismantled, with citizenship restricted to property owners. For the next century and a half, Athens became a political pawn, passed between the warring successors of Alexander's empire, Cassander, Demetrius Poliorcetes, and others, each treating the city as a prize to be occupied rather than a power to be feared. At one point, Athens allied with Sparta and Ptolemaic Egypt in a failed attempt to break free of Macedonian dominance. It lost, and Macedonian garrisons were stationed permanently in the city. But something interesting happened in the middle of all this political humiliation. Athens' philosophical reputation only grew. Around 300 BC, a merchant named Zeno of Citium began teaching in the city's painted Stoa, founding what would become Stoicism. Around the same time, Epicurus bought a house and garden just outside the city walls and founded his own school, teaching that the good life was found in modest pleasure and freedom from anxiety, not political power or wealth, a philosophy, one imagines, particularly appealing to a city that had recently lost both. Foreign kings, eager to associate themselves with Athens' cultural prestige, started competing to fund its monuments. A king of Pergamon built an enormous covered marketplace, the Stoa of Attalos, along the edge of the ancient agora. A Syrian king resumed construction on that massive temple of Olympian Zeus that Pisistratus had started 3 centuries earlier. Athens had lost its army, its empire, and its independence, but it had discovered something almost as valuable, brand equity that outlasted political power entirely. Rome's favorite classroom when Rome absorbed Greece into its expanding republic after 146 BC. Athens was given a special status as a free city, exempt from direct taxation, allowed to keep its own local laws, purely because of its intellectual reputation. That privileged arrangement nearly ended in disaster when Athens made the catastrophic decision to ally with a Persian-adjacent king named Mithridates VI against Rome. In 87 and 86 BC, the Roman general Sulla laid siege to the city, eventually breaching the walls and unleashing a massacre inside, while also burning the docks and arsenals of Piraeus to the ground. And yet, this is the pattern by now, isn't it? Even after Sulla's devastation, elite Romans still considered an education in Athens essential. Julius Caesar and Mark Antony personally funded reconstruction. And under the emperors, Athens entered a genuine architectural renaissance. Augustus built new civic monuments. But the real turning point came with Hadrian, a Roman emperor so infatuated with Greek culture that he made repeated extended visits to Athens, finally completing the 6th-century-long construction of the Temple of Olympian Zeus, building an entirely new residential district, constructing a grand library, and even establishing a formal league of Greek cities headquartered in the city. A wealthy Athenian senator named Herodes Atticus added to the transformation, building the beautiful stone theater, the Odeon, that still hosts performances on the slope of the Acropolis today. And somewhere in the middle of all this Roman patronage, a new and very different force arrived in the city. Around AD 50, the Apostle Paul walked into Athens and, according to the biblical book of Acts, delivered a sermon on the Areopagus itself, using an altar dedicated to an unknown God as his opening line to introduce Christian theology to a city that had spent 5 centuries perfecting pagan philosophy. Athens didn't know it yet, but its entire spiritual identity was about to be rewritten. The city that kept changing gods in AD 267, disaster struck again. A Germanic tribe called the Heruli invaded Greece and sacked Athens, burning much of its public architecture. In response, the Athenians did something that tells you everything about how the city viewed its own past. They built a new, smaller defensive wall using stones salvaged directly from the ruins of their own destroyed classical monuments. A wall built, quite literally, out of the wreckage of the Golden Age. Even so, the philosophical schools endured for another 2.5 centuries. Future emperors and future church fathers studied side by side in Athenian lecture halls. But in AD 529, Emperor Justinian I issued an edict banning pagans from holding teaching positions, effectively defunding the last operating remnant of Plato's Academy, nearly 1,000 years after it was founded. Around the same time, in one of the most striking transformations in the city's long history, the Parthenon itself was converted into a Christian church dedicated to the Virgin Mary. The Erechtheion became a church too. So did the Hephaestion down in the Agora. The temples hadn't moved an inch. The gods inside them had simply changed. A quiet Byzantine province for the next several centuries, Athens settled into a much quieter role, a provincial town within the Byzantine Empire's administrative system, no longer a center of political or philosophical power, but still not forgotten. In AD 797, an Athenian woman named Irene actually became empress of the entire Byzantine Empire, and her relative Theophano was later chosen through an imperial bride show as well. By the 10th and 11th centuries, the city experienced a modest economic revival, becoming known for olive oil, silk weaving, and dye production, modest wealth that funded a series of beautiful domed churches still standing in Athens today. In 1018, the Byzantine Emperor Basil II, fresh off a brutal military victory that earned him the nickname the Bulgar Slayer, made a pilgrimage to Athens specifically to offer prayers inside the Parthenon Cathedral. And in the final decades before disaster struck again, the city's archbishop, Michael Coniates, left behind writings lamenting the corruption of imperial tax collectors and the decline of classical Greek into a local dialect, a portrait of a city that knew, even then, that it was a shadow of what it had once been. That shadow was about to get darker still. Knights, mercenaries, and bankers in 1204, crusaders heading toward Jerusalem instead sacked Constantinople, shattering the Byzantine Empire and carving its territory into a patchwork of Western feudal states. A Burgundian knight named Otto de la Roche claimed Athens for himself, taking the title Lord of Athens, soon upgraded to Duke. And for the next 2 centuries, Athens found itself ruled not by Greeks, but by a rotating caste of Western European feudal lords. The de la Roche family converted the Propylaea, the monumental gateway to the Acropolis, into a private ducal palace, and built a massive stone tower at its entrance. The Parthenon became a Roman Catholic cathedral. But in 1311, everything changed again. In one of the more brutal episodes of the entire story, the reigning duke hired a band of mercenaries known as the Catalan Company to fight a rival power, and when he tried to dismiss them without paying what he owed, they killed him and his entire nobility on the battlefield, then simply took the duchy for themselves. For decades, Athens was governed in Catalan, under laws imported from Barcelona. By 1388, a Florentine banking family, the Acciaioli, seized control from the Catalans, and, in an interesting reversal, actually restored Greek as the language of administration and reinstated an Orthodox bishop. For nearly 70 more years, Athens remained a small Italian-ruled duchy, increasingly squeezed by a much larger power rising to its east. For centuries under the crescent moon in 1456, Ottoman forces captured the lower town of Athens, and by 1458, the last duke had surrendered the Acropolis itself. Sultan Mehmed II personally visited the city and, according to the historical record, was impressed enough by its ancient monuments to grant it special protections, an early, unlikely moment of heritage preservation in the middle of a military conquest. For nearly 4 centuries, Athens settled into life as an Ottoman provincial town. It's tempting to imagine this period as some kind of dark, empty interlude, and honestly, that's exactly how a lot of later nationalist history books described it. But the reality on the ground was more complicated. Athens had its own layered system of governance, an Ottoman civil governor called a voivode handling taxes, an Islamic judge called a qadi overseeing law, a military commander called a distar controlling the fortress on the Acropolis, and, crucially, a council of 4 elected Greek Christian elders called domagerantes, who managed local disputes and represented the Christian majority to Ottoman authority. The Acropolis itself became a military garrison. The Parthenon, already a church for nearly 900 years by this point, was converted into the town's principal mosque, with a minaret built right into the old medieval bell tower. Down the hill, the population divided into ethnic neighborhoods, Muslims settling closer to the fortress, Christians occupying the districts still known today as Plaka and Siri. Then, on a September evening in 1687, disaster struck in the most dramatic single moment in the entire history of the building. Venetian forces, at war with the Ottomans, laid siege to Athens and learned that the Ottoman garrison was storing gunpowder inside the Parthenon itself, apparently gambling that its ancient sanctity would keep it safe from attack. It didn't. A Venetian mortar shell scored a direct hit, detonating the powder magazine in a blast that killed roughly 300 people, collapsed the temple's central chamber, and destroyed 28 of its columns in a single instant. A building that had survived nearly 2,000 years of empires, religions, and invasions was gutted in one catastrophic explosion, arguably more architectural damage in one night than in the previous 2 millennia combined. A century later, in 1778, facing raids from Ottoman Albanian warbands, a notoriously harsh local governor named Haji Ali Haseki built a 10-kilometer defensive wall around the town in a staggering 70 to 108 days, a construction pace only possible because he conscripted the entire population and tore apart ancient monuments for building material, including a temple to Artemis that had stood for over 2,000 years. In one striking historical echo, Haseki actually evacuated the entire Christian population to the nearby island of Salamis for 13 days during the crisis. The exact same island, the exact same defensive maneuver that Themistocles had used against the Persians 22 centuries earlier, whether anyone at the time noticed the parallel or not. Athens, by this point, was a modest provincial town of perhaps 10 to 12,000 people. It was not, by any reasonable measure, a major city, but it was still, unmistakably, Athens, and the memory of what it had once been was about to matter more than anyone in the town itself could have predicted. Rising from the rubble in 1821, revolution broke out across Greece, and Athens found itself violently caught in the middle of it. Greek insurgents besieged the Ottoman garrison trapped on the Acropolis, and in June 1822, after running out of water, the defenders finally surrendered the fortress. It didn't last. In 1826, a massive Ottoman army returned and laid siege to the city for 10 grueling months, and after a decisive defeat of the Greek relief force in May 1827, the exhausted defenders finally surrendered the Acropolis back to Ottoman control. Remarkably, Ottoman troops continued occupying the fortress until 1833, years after the treaty establishing Greek independence had already been signed, only finally withdrawing when Bavarian soldiers arrived to formally take possession on behalf of Greece's new king. By the time the fighting stopped, Athens was, in the most literal sense, a ruin. The population had collapsed from around 12,000 before the revolution to somewhere between 4,000 and 7,000 people, crowded into roughly 300 usable houses. The roads were rubble. The water systems were broken. It was, by any conventional standard, one of the worst possible candidates to become the capital of a modern nation. And yet, in September 1834, that's exactly what King Otto decided. Regional leaders had pushed hard for Nafplio, the existing provisional capital with functioning port infrastructure, or for the island of Aegina. Athens offered almost none of the practical advantages a new government needed. What it offered instead was symbolism, the chance for a fragile new kingdom, desperate for legitimacy on the European stage, to present itself as the direct heir of classical civilization, ruling from the very rock where democracy itself had been born. German and Greek architects drew up sweeping neoclassical plans for wide boulevards and grand public squares. And in one of the most quietly radical decisions of the entire era, King Otto ordered the military garrison removed from the Acropolis altogether and declared the site an official archaeological monument. Within a year, restoration work had begun, dismantling the Ottoman mosque that had stood inside the ruined Parthenon for nearly 2 centuries, in a deliberate effort to strip away everything except the classical core underneath. 3,200 years after Mycenaean builders first raised a cyclopean wall around that same rock to survive a collapsing world, Athens had done it again. Burned by Persians, imperial, and then defeated, sacked by Romans, converted by Christians, occupied by Crusaders, ruled by Ottomans, blown apart by Venetian gunpowder, and reduced to rubble in its own war for independence. And still, somehow, it was the city they chose to rebuild a nation around. That's not really a story about buildings. It's a story about what a place can survive when the idea behind it refuses to die. If you're wondering what actually happened next, how a town of 7,000 people turned into the sprawling modern capital of Athens we know today, and what archaeologists found once they finally started digging beneath the rubble, that's a whole story of its own, and it's waiting for you in the next video on screen.